This is Tim Holmes, and I want to share with you a tale of one of the most exciting adventures in my whole life, one which took place in October of 1980, when I was able to sail for several days in the Mediterranean on a ship called the Anne Linde. It was built after the plan of a two-masted schooner called America II, which was built in 1851, and at the time was the fastest ship in the world, having won a British yacht race, which ever since then has been called the America Cup. The narrative is taken from the journals of myself and Paul Kleinhaus, who is a German one-legged sailor who was on board with us. The context is, I was traveling around Europe with Steve Harper, and we were about to meet up with my parents for a trip over to Greece. We had just arrived at Brindisi, Italy, and checked into a hotel, and here's where the narrative begins. We checked out the ferry location, then wandered down to the waterside to the big column that marks the end of the Appian Way. It was here that ships landed from Greece and points east, with goods for Rome and points in between. Looking down, I saw a beautiful two-masted schooner dockside, and an older man walking about thereon. I mentioned that I'd love to go talk to him, but the guy was probably a rich jerk and I wanted to explore an arch I saw inland. But we went down to the ship, looked it over, and then the fellow came by and I said, "Il tuo barcavela è molto bellissimo." "Are you French?" he said, in a heavy accent. "No, English." We carried on a bit of a conversation about the boat. It's 28 meters long by 22 high. The fellow was German and was only chartering the boat with two others and the skipper, all German. Well, one thing led to another, and soon the three were up and they popped the question. They needed a couple of crewmen. But they couldn't take me because I was going to Greece and they were going to Spain. I could take care of that, I said. I needed to consult with the parents, but then I told them I'd return at 8 a.m. with an answer. The deciding was no problem. I was convinced this was a perfect opportunity. I've always wanted to haul the lines of a sailing ship, and this was a beautiful ship and a perfect situation. I couldn't pass it up. Steve was not interested in the slightest bit. He wanted Greece. The parents got in from Switzerland 1 hour late. We went to the hotel and had our conference. Dad agreed I couldn't pass it up. Mom was worried that I'd not had enough to eat, that I'd be too cold, get lost, sick, or lose my mind, etc. But they agreed to go on to Greece and meet me later. The folks in England and Steve in Milano. With that, we went to bed. Monday. The shipmates invited me in for breakfast and I was introduced all around. Paul Kleinhaus, the older man, was a wonderfully jolly fellow with a bad leg, amputated below the knee as a result of a war injury, just 5 days or miles or something before he got home at the end of the war, a soldier returning from the Russian front. Oswald is about 45, a rounder fellow with the best English vocabulary of the lot. Gerda is the woman, born in Holland, married a Swiss, and moved there 25 years ago. Helmut is the captain, a well-built, bronzed man of about 38 years, a handsome devil sporting sharp features like Nureyev, Rudolph, with a good head of blonde hair. We spoke about a few details, made last-minute plans over tea, and then we all made last-minute preparations. We in the town, they on board. In an hour, all was ready. I climbed aboard and began hauling up sails with the others so the folks could get a photo. Then we were off. We motored out for a few miles and then turned her off and ran with the wind. Ah, what an incredible feeling. I sat on the prow for a long time, feeling the wind, the power, the singing waltzes as the stem plunged into a wave and was thrown back up 12 or 14 feet. Ah! When it became too dark to write in this Tagebuch, I sat in the cockpit, absorbing. I went down to write for a while, but started to feel seasick a little. I don't think that's ever happened to me before. I took one of the pills Mom made me bring, sat up in the wind, and all went pretty well. Rather than sail all night, we opted for putting in at Otranto. The generator, which we mended ourselves, is up the spout again, so it's no fridge for us again, but no night travelling either. At night the village looked beautiful. Stone buildings were lit up and the port was quiet and calm. Pulling in the harbour, I tried to communicate with the natives as to where and for how long we could tie up, but it was a donde we park situation. I could be of hardly any use. I could speak a few words, but couldn't understand much of what they said. Damn! Finally they let us tie up to another boat for 4 hours. The 19th sun. Awakened at 5, we snuck down a bit of tea and hauled off. Hoisted the sails, started the motor, and we were off. Down the coast we went, passing old stone watchtowers and fortresses, some with stone walls erected along the tops of ridges connecting them, no doubt to keep the ancient Greeks or Turks out. The coastline was fascinating. I searched carefully with binoculars for old architecture, particularly ruins. I took the helm for an hour or so as our course brought us closer and closer to the shore. As we rounded the point, I couldn't help but take several pictures of the spectacular sea caves, above which thousands of stone walls laced the hills like fishnets, all over everywhere. I had a hard time comprehending how many stones and how many man-hours that represented. The wind had been at 220 degrees all day. Our course was 190, too close for sailing. As we rounded the point, we turned right into the wind. Suddenly, after about a mile, we came about, to run before the wind. We let out the sails, turned off the motor, and made for the last harbour. We were low on fuel, and Helmut thought that this was his last chance before we tried to cross the Gulf of Taranto. We pulled slowly into Porto Tricasa, which the natives said was 3 meters deep, just the depth of our keel. We maneuvered and hugged the dock, all the while carefully watching the keel through the clear blue-green water. I'm amazed at the clarity of this water. These are not particularly clean people, and yet the water looks like a Montana glacial lake. We gathered quite an audience as we tied up in this tiny harbor. There are probably not many ships of this size around, in which case we're sort of temporary celebrities, not like any old traveler off the 503 train. It felt great to suddenly become a celebrity when I'd been a stupid tourist for so long. I spoke to some boys leaning against the boat. Boys will be more patient with me than men. They're more impressed, less socially rigid, I should think. That didn't last long. I grabbed my camera and sketchbook when I heard that we would be there until morning, and debarked. There were a couple of girls sitting on one of the mooring posts. One was a striking blonde, not Italian-looking at all. "Che è questa castile?" I said, pointing to the castle at the edge of the harbor. That got things going. As soon as I made a fool of myself and got them laughing, I was all right. In a few minutes, the crew left the boat and headed for the road. The girls came with me. They helped me ask my questions in Italiano and answered them slowly. I was speaking to Italians. When we passed the castle and one of them, Patrizia, said in good English that her uncle lived there, I made them pose for a shot. While the crew was making some sort of plans in the yacht club, I spoke and laughed and made a bigger fool of myself and tried to get them to take me on a tour of the city. On the way back to the Anne Linde, I passed by the castle. Looking up past the ivied balcony to the moon, I suddenly became aware of Romeo and Juliet. What a perfect balcony! What a perfect Mediterranean night! It was wonderful. Here I am thousands of miles from home and hundreds from my family, and yet just today I've been accompanied around the village by a handful of young friends, taken by a strange man in his car to eat at a restaurant full of people who seemed pleased to have me there, and then taken to sleep on the beautiful ship of other friends who 3 days ago I'd never met. Amazing! Who would ever have dreamed that I would be leading such a life? I sleep in the first berth on the port side just forward of the salon. It's not a terribly long berth, but it seems to do the trick. In order to get out, I have to do all the bending that my body hates to do in the morning, but what a fun place to wake up in. The Anne Linde looks impressive from across the harbor, big, black, with slender, powerful bow and all kinds of rigging. I was proud to be working her. Since the diesel man wouldn't be coming from Tricasa till 2, I gathered my equipment and took off for the nearest ruin. Along the way, I practiced my Italiano, which is steadily improving, and made notes in my Italiano notebook. About 4 or 5 kilometers along the coast to the north, I began climbing up the hill, through olive orchards, terraced into the slope hundreds of years ago, I'm sure, and eating kiwa fruits from the cacti along the way. It took me only one lipful of stickers to discover that they should be peeled before being eaten. The view from the top of the ridge was indeed lovely. I only wish the air had been clearer. Sunshine would have helped, I'm sure, but the air just didn't seem to be as clear as in Montana. Like riding through Germany on the train, the entire valley was full of haze, as were the mountains of Italy, the harbors of Amsterdam, and the morning of Brindisi. I sat down in the ruin, which appears to have been merely a watchtower, about 4 or 5 meters square and 2 stories high. In the middle of the second story was a gaping hole into the first, below which was a chamber. I suppose it was merely to save stone in the building. No outlet. If I fell in, I kept telling myself, it would be the next historically minded athletic tourist who would discover my bones. Behind the tower was a plateau full of fields. It must have been a hardy people who took up this stretch of land. No wonder there were so many stone walls everywhere. The rocks were thick as weeds. They must have farmed in between the big ones, which had never been moved, and were numerous enough to discourage any farmer I'd ever heard of. The big ones were piled with little ones, which saved that many trips to the wall. This made for fields of little pillars. Very interesting. Across a little farm road was a lovely olive orchard, which I drew in ink. I can see why Van Gogh is so intrigued. It was enough to make me want to stay much longer, but I had to get back to the diesel loading.
At last, ropes away and off in the direction of Cretone. The 4 o'clock weather report was good, with wind 3 to 6 on the scale, now and then rain, seas, and no waves.
We didn't shove off then until about 4 or 5. There was a good wind and the weather was looking pretty good, except for storm clouds to the northeast. We waved to the people gathering around the harbor to watch us go, and we started hauling up the sail. Almost immediately, the derrick on the mainmast broke. It holds the boom attached in 3 places, one on each side of the sail. So we rigged up the chair. They said they were going to haul me up to the mast, but Helmut ended up doing it. It's just as well, because I wouldn't have known how to fix it. I often don't know what's going on until after it's happened, and sometimes not even then, because everything is said in German. I've learned most of the German terms for the parts of the ship and the major instructions, but nothing more than that. My year of the language at Rocky didn't help a bit. I've forgotten almost all. We sailed southward, past the same point we had rounded the day before, and off to the blue over the Gulf of Taranto. The wind was from behind and quite strong. Within a couple hours it had increased, and we were running about 7 to 8 knots. As darkness fell, the swells increased. Every so often the ship would heel over to the port side, and then the main boom would plunge into the crest of that wave. Oh, I loved it. I said a little Dankeschön to the captain in the sky each time. This is real sailing, I thought to myself, as we plunged from wave to wave, speeding in front of the wind. Oswald and I were to be on watch from 20 to 22 and from 2 to 4 hours. I began at the helm about 7:30 or so, loving every minute of it, so I didn't care about being early at all. I was getting a bit wet, however, so I put on the foul weather gear that had been laid out for me. Margin note: we would have taken down the sails if we had known what was coming next, but there was no indication in the weather report. The wind picked up about 45 miles an hour at 21 or so, and stayed there. The swells were up to 2 or 3 meters, though they were long and regular, so they didn't look so terribly big. The ship, however, was feeling it, and began to heel over quite a ways. Suddenly, there was a shout from the captain, and I looked back just as he grabbed for the block for the main boom sheet. It had come loose from its shackle on the stern, and had almost been tossed overboard, which it would have been, needless to say, a great loss. He quickly tied the block down and came to the attention of my problem. The wind was so fresh I couldn't hold the course. I was trying to hold 225 degrees, and I had the wheel cranked all the way over to the port side, and still we were running 240 or 250. Helmet let out the main boom, which I didn't like to see because it cut our speed a bit. But the wind grew stronger, and soon he had let out the foreboom as well. We hadn't set the jenny, which was untied on the bow. Oswald went forward to lash that. The flying jib was furled, and the jib up. I went below for a moment and noticed water on the floor of the galley. The skipper went down to check it out, making various obscene-sounding noises. I later discovered that it was fresh water. Our water tank, which is apparently open, emptied itself all over the engine room floor when we rode one particularly large wave. That means no more fresh water. The rope hatch covers were plywood and not well secured. Oswald ventured out to remove them and put them in their hatches. I would have loved to have risked my little neck out of the cockpit, but they wouldn't let me go. I hadn't paid my passage yet. Even though I knew things were beginning to get serious, I was still having a good time. The first time I got a bit surprised was when a large wave broke on the starboard side of the hull and we all got drenched. Soon after that we were pitched over far enough for the sea to engulf an entire third of the deck lengthwise. Water poured into the cockpit. I knew it was time to change my tennis shoes, but the captain wouldn't let me go below. I was terribly worried about my camera. I had visions of it floating in a soggy mess under my berth. The seawater hadn't entered the gallery. I was just concerned about a vent. We fell off to about 205 degrees to avoid hitting the waves so strongly, but it didn't help much. The swells were up to 4 meters. The wind was up to 7 or 8 on the Seaman scale, whatever it's called, gale conditions if I recall. We were making about 10 knots.
About 21:30, Gerda gets up and goes to the loo. She said quietly the next day, "That's the first time ever in my life I've sat at an angle on the loo." So she went through the ship with her torch at an angle. It must have smelt vile, for the entire floor of the rear part of the ship was under oil. The waves were already 3.5 meters high.
Many of the lines on deck were washing over, so I had the chance to hop over the rail just long enough to drag them into the cockpit. It was indeed staggering to think that one could be washed over with merely a small wave, and once over, one's chances for recovery were mighty slim. A ship this size, with sails up and uncontrollable, would find it very hard to come about and retrieve a crewman. Yet, somehow, I was never frightened. In fact, that concerned me. Didn't I know how close I was to certain death? I tried to figure out why it was that I felt so fearless. After all, I'm a flaming coward. I concluded that the reason was that I was so comfortable. Wet, yes, but quite warm. The wind was warm, and surprisingly, so was the water. In fact, I looked forward to the big waves that would wash the decks and behoove me to reach into the swirling brine to grab a hold of a rigging hook, which was resting on the port deck next to the cockpit. It had been untied from the shrouds, from which it was threatening to break.
Suddenly, the pulley block from under the mainsail snapped off on deck. The next time the ship listed, we were able to grab hold of the sheet rope and do a makeshift repair job on it.
As long as I was not uncomfortable, I guess I was not frightened. In fact, I even thought it would be better to be in the brine than to have to stay with a sinking ship. This idea was not entirely out of the question. The situation seemed to be getting more and more serious.
A further and stronger gust had the effect of causing the porthole pennant to tear off the schooner.
Gerda was very sick all night long. She threw up everything she had and more, and made these terrible noises all the while. I would gaze out into the sea and hear a sea monster behind us so that I wouldn't start thinking seasickness myself. She must have been exhausted by morning. What an awful way to pass the night. I don't know why she didn't go below. Fresh air, I suppose. I kept dragging myself from one side of the boat to the other, seeking out the most exciting views. Off the port, the wild boom. Off the starboard, the looming seas. I sang waltzes and sad songs and even ran through a couple Monty Python bits to assure myself that I was still maintaining a good sense of humor throughout. But the most effective song was my own, The Survivor, or whatever, about the shipwrecked sailor. I just loved singing it amid the crashing of the sea and creaking of the boat. I would sing the lines over and over because they sounded so good. No time to die, nobody tried. No one survived but me, only me.
Down in the salon, I got the gist of what was going on only from hearing the noises, and was quite fretting until a great quantity of water snapped me out of my thoughts. The limp-hanging schooner sail had wrenched open the window on the starboard side of the salon, and the ceaselessly invading sea coming over the sides had now found a way into the boat itself.
Finally, I had my opportunity to check my gear and change into my boots. I found the camera had tumbled into the corner of the bunk, but was resting there like a sleeping baby. The other corner of the bunk was wet, but no other damage. I returned to the cockpit, boot-clad, resumed my position by the chartboard, taking the split seconds that the foreboom rose above the level of the swells to watch for lights ahead.
Now the main boom was raging back and forth out of control as the porthole pennant was ripped too.
I passed a couple of hours like this, kneeling in the corner, back to the rain, singing and peeking at the compass, wiping the salt from my eyes when I got drenched, and looking for anything washing off the deck.
The sky remained black with its ring of squalls enclosing us.
Sometime in the night, Helmut started the motor. I suppose the reason was to ease pressure on the sails or to make better time. We motored all that night. Next time I went below for something, I found Paul sitting inside the salon. I had wondered how he could sleep in these swells. He wasn't sleeping. He was standing ready with his wooden leg to be ready to help at a moment's notice. As I passed, he whispered to me, "Alles ist freiwillig," which he likes to say when things are not going well. All is voluntary. It must have been about 3 a.m. when the major things started to fail. The first thing to go was the main boom sheet, block, and tackle, which broke loose again. The boom swung clear out, its enormous block dragging the last of the line in the water.
Oswald noticed that something was wrong with the main sheet, and it was worn through completely at the makeshift attachment.
I was sure the other block on the deck side, an antique one from some old sailing vessel, was gone. I later found this to be untrue. I noticed the sky was now dark. The waves were very hard to see. Over the starboard side they blacked out the horizon. Every so often I got a bit of a fright when the level of waves would clear the stars from my gaze, or the horizon suddenly snuck up on me from that side, and I knew that we were being approached by an enormous wave. It was about then that the wind became a lot more erratic. Gusting, it would blow the boat over more than 45 degrees. Water washed the deck to the level of my waist, though I was standing behind the protective wall of the cockpit. We lost one of the wooden covers for the rope hatches, both of which had been stuffed down into the hatches for safety. The main boom now swung freely past our heads with every pitch of the ship. One false move, and it's off with your head. The sail surfer boom came loose, and we managed to rescue that as well as a lifeboat oar, but it was much too dangerous to venture out of the cockpit. The boat was being thrown violently in all directions, which made it quite difficult to stand even in the cockpit. Suddenly, a loud crack shot out of the raging storm. The foregaff had broken. The wind had torn loose the rope that holds the boom out in an aft wind as well, so the boom would swing in over toward the starboard until we heeled to port again, when it would slam back into the water. But it wasn't too long before the sheet, block, and tackle wedged its ropes underneath the very securely fastened sail surfer and started prying it loose with all the weight of the boom and sail as well as that of the storm. I kept as close an eye as possible on that board for the next hour or two. The wind, meanwhile, was tearing at the broken gaff, which I was expecting to fall in a great cascade of defeat at any moment. It was hard to see the gaff behind the mainmast, but every so often we would catch a glimpse of that fallen corpse caught in the rigging of the sail. The sail itself appeared to be torn, as had become apparent with the mysterious dancing of the shreds when they broke the obscurity of the mainmast.
Now the main boom was raging back and forth out of control as the porthole pennant was ripped too.
All the while it was becoming darker and harder to see. Then, suddenly, the main gaff snapped with another piercing crack, the kind of wood-splitting sound that is so painful in situations where it shouldn't be happening. There was a gasp from the crew, and I looked up to see the ragged end piercing through the top of the sail. I was certain the thing would come crashing down at any minute. The whole business was getting a little too serious for me. For the first time, I began to question our safety. I began having thoughts about losing the ship. She was a terribly strong ship, but she had broken and the weather wasn't letting up. I had the distinct feeling that the main gaff was going to come down. The wind was tearing at the ship, causing the sails to snap like deep, powerful whips. And that splintered log was jabbing and tearing at the sail as if some unseen enemy were trying to rip apart the sail with this enormous splinter to get at us. We cowered helplessly in the bottom of the cockpit, save for the skipper who fought to keep course amid his cursings. With great distrust, I kept my eyes glued on this oversized toothpick, 14 feet long and as thick as my leg, dangling 40 feet over my head and threatening to plunge downward at any moment to pierce me like a hors d'oeuvre. This point in the storm constituted one of those rare points in my life when time seemed to be intensified, a period when the immediate future is wide open and there isn't a hint as to how it will turn. Every second counts. Anxiety. Margin note. I neglected to mention that the little phosphorescent organisms that glow when disturbed were in the sea in fairly small numbers, but as the storm wore on, they seemed to increase in intensity and number. They flew like sparks when we rose up and plunged down into a wave, and I instinctively flicked them off me like sparks. But they also gave a weird, surrealistic quality to the whole ordeal. What with the waltzes and the glowing critters, it seemed like we were sailing inside one of those half-spheres filled with water and fake snow. Ironically, when just hours before I was giving thanks for the exciting seas, I now prayed for the safety of the ship. I was perfectly comfortable and still not frightened, but I was sure that the whole mass of wood, rigging, and canvas was going to come crashing down on us, and if the whole mess went overboard, there was little hope. I hadn't realized at the time that the gaff had broken forward of the peak, the gaff hoist after, so that both parts were still connected to the mast quite securely in both cases. The wind whipped the sails, cracked them with loud reports that were not so dangerous as they were startling. I couldn't believe that the mainsail was holding fast. Like a devil toying with a helpless victim, the sea was taking hold of the foreboom and swinging it over to starboard to get a good hard slam over on the port side. The boom looked just like a wrecking crane, its block the enormous ball with which the sea was amusing itself by making the ship tear herself apart. Finally, the sail surfer was wrenched from her railing and the sea claimed her. An expensive loss. The brine tried also to take the rope ladder stowed in a port hatch, but fortunately the flying jib sheet was caught in it and trailed behind to the cockpit, allowing me to yank the ladder back into place. I prayed hard and sincerely for the ship and for Giada, who kept retching what she didn't have. For a moment the sky cleared right overhead and the wind died. I breathed a sigh, and when my tension waned, the wind picked up and the sail screamed out again. Lord, let me be cold and wet, let the camera fall into a pool of water, but let the ship live. How long these vicious waves and hungry wind? How long this driving rain? How long this suffering woman? I kept looking for a glimmer of light behind the clouds to the east, The dawn should have been on its way by now. We were all very tired. In spite of the terrible racket and the heaving ship, I was nodding off. So was Oswald, the only one I could see in the darkness. Suddenly, I spotted a light under the foreboom about 15 degrees off the port bow, a double light. But it was much too steady for a ship. As we learned, which took a terribly long time, we'd spotted a beacon and land lights. The captain turned on the radar, which was right across the mainmast from the shattered gaff. It was the only way we could avoid the rocks. I was sure it was only a matter of minutes until the radar would be knocked out one way or another. We rounded the point, and sure enough, the radar went out along with the mast lights. Now we were invisible, and my job became looking for the lights of approaching ships. The radar hadn't been hit, but the wires must have shorted. Well, at least we're headed in. The wind eased a bit, and the waves, coming now from the coast, were not so vicious, but we weren't getting any closer to the land. I later discovered the reason. Along the entire length of the ball and toe of Italy's boot, there are no ports. The main boom had been swinging freely into the port shrouds, the furthest aft of which had carved a gouge an inch deep in the boom. We secured a line on the boom to make a Bullenstande, to keep the boom from the shroud, but the rope took a tough beating, and just before it snapped, we had time to tie another. The light finally did come, timidly, from behind the storm clouds to the east. I could finally see what was the cause of the periodic angry zings I was hearing from the bow. The jib had broken loose from its halyard and was running freely up and down the stay with the whimsy of the wind. I had been guzzling cold coffee for some time, trying to keep myself awake, when Helmut finally poked me on the shoulder and said, "You sleep for 2-3 hours, okay?" I did. Tuesday, the 21st of October. I felt awful upon arising. My hair was mashed down flat, matted with dry, sticky salt. Salt clung to my face. My shoes were wet. The bottom of my sleeping sheet bag was soaked. Yuck. I ate some bread and coffee and went topside. In the light, I surveyed the damage. Everything looked really tired and sore, but the weather had stabilized.
The sky was once more on friendly terms with the earth, though we on deck were still clearing away the debris and taking stock of the situation to total up what the night had cost. It was only now that you could see how the ship looked. Seawater had even worked its way into the sugar basin. Helmut's neck coffee was with seawater sugar. It stank of oil, as I reported, but there was a penetrating stink of something else too. The pipe from the sewage must have broken, because now oil and wastewater had been pumped into the 2 washing up sinks and slopped over into all the plates, cups, and liquor glasses, splashing everywhere. Guten Appetit! And all is voluntary.
We proceeded to gently furl the sails, main, fore, and jib, all torn and badly beaten, and tie them down with der Benzellen.
When we came to taking the sails, we discovered that the storm had also washed the new white mooring rope out of the rope box. The heavy 35-meter-long anchoring rope had got caught in the last spike on the rope box and had been dragging for several hours. If you stop and think about it, you start to shudder. Just imagine that rope coming into tangles with the propeller in the situation we were in. Well, rather not.
The sun appeared, and the swells were only a meter or so in height. We had come through with only so much damage and no injuries. Thanks, Great Spirit. I hung out some of my things to dry. We opened the vents and hatches, and we sailed on towards Reggio, apparently the first port on our course. And even so, we wouldn't get in until about 21 hours or so. I must mention that I love being on the bowsprit. When Oswald and I were furling the jib, I noticed how phony the whole scene looked. As the bow rose and fell, the horizon moved, but from my perspective, Oswald and the sprit were stable. It reminded me of the old movies where the action takes place in a still studio with the moving background, projected on a screen behind. Not realistic at all. The sea was an angry blue-gray, nothing at all like the beautiful deep phthalocyaline blue of its usual temperament, but by evening it had forgotten the colors of the tempest. That night, just after dark, we limped into Porto Reggio, and I was not the only one that was happy to be back on dry land again. The 22nd we spent in port at Reggio, taking off the sails and gaffs. In the evening we drove around in Paul's rented van to find steel for new gaffs. We came home after dark with 2 4-meter lengths of rectangular pipe for the gaffs, and a few pieces of rod to form loops to attach the peak and clow, block and tackle. The days don't last long around here. We used up 3 of them repairing the boat. I did quite a bit of welding on the gaffs and elsewhere, hoisted sails around and pulled on this and hammered that.
I wrangled the Ford bus with which the sails were taken for repair. Boy, does it feel like miles when you're used to the 15 to 20 square yards of sailing space on your own ship.
The sails had been repaired quite quickly, which pleased the captain until we discovered what a shoddy job it was. We had to return the foresail for some extra stitches, but with the others we took no further chances. Having restrung the sails and finished the necessary repairs, we slept. The morning found us again, prepared to sail.
Gerda attempted to get through to her husband Bruno on the phone and got picked up in a car. We were quite worried about her. She was taken to a hospital, but still could not get a line and had to be driven by taxi to the central telephone exchange.
If anyone had told me a month ago that I would be spending these moments with 4 Germans on a sailing ship in a beautiful Mediterranean port, I'd never have believed them. What gifts! I'm sure this is an adventure I shall recall for the rest of my days. How lucky I have been. Well, I lost touch with the other crewmen, but I stayed in touch with Paul for many years after that. He and I wrote to each other 2 or 3 times a year, and in 1994, when Claudia and I went to Paris, he drove down from Germany to spend a few days with us there. A couple of years later, he died. He had always been a sailor. He loved sailing, and I'm so glad I got to share that experience with him.